大家好. And if I remember Hongkongese correctly, Mukoi-sai? Well, anyway, greetings from Yokohama, Japan, where I live. I thank Limpen for the kind introduction. I work for Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto, and I specialize in disability studies. And it is my great pleasure and privilege to talk to you all from China. That includes Hong Kong. So I'll be talking about the CRPD Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in Japan, focusing on accessibility and reasonable accommodation. I start with the relationship between accessibility and reasonable accommodation. I'm very sure you're very much familiar with accessibility already, and perhaps with the reasonable accommodation. But the relationship between accessibility and reasonable accommodation is a bit tricky. And then move on to the legal developments in Japan for the accessibility for buildings and transportation, and legal developments for accessibility for information. And finally, I already spot my mistake. It's here, it says 2023 initial CRPD review of Japan. No, it was last year. So it's 2022 initial, or the first CRPD review of Japan in the field of accessibility and perhaps a bit discrimination. So we need to promote, or we need both accessibility and reasonable accommodation. And of course, reasonable accommodation comes under disability-based discrimination. If you don't provide reasonable accommodation, it's a disability-based discrimination. So we need to promote both accessibility on one hand and prohibit disability-based discrimination, including the denial of reasonable accommodation. So we might call this twin track approach for the rights of persons with disabilities, particularly in the field of buildings, transportation, and information. When we go back to CRPD for the definition of discrimination on the basis of disability, CRPD says discrimination on the basis of disability means any distinction, exclusion, or restriction on the basis of disability, which has the purpose or effect of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal basis with others of all human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, civil, or any other field. It includes all forms of discrimination, including denial of reasonable accommodation. And the CRPD further defines reasonable accommodation as follows. Reasonable accommodation means necessary and appropriate modification and adjustments, not imposing a disproportionate or undue burden, where needed in a particular case to ensure to persons with disabilities the enjoyment or exercise on an equal basis with others of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. So reasonable accommodation means modification and adjustments. This term was used in US, but in UK, for the same meaning, they use the term reasonable adjustment. So the core of this term is making modification and adjustments. In other words, making exceptions. Making exceptions. That is the core idea of reasonable accommodation. There's a rule made for persons without disabilities. Our societies have many rules created for persons without disabilities. So, if the rules are not good for persons with disabilities, we have to make changes or we have to make exceptions to that rule. That is the core idea of reasonable accommodation. General comment is what the CRPD committee adopts as an important interpretation of particular articles of the CRPD. General comment number 2 is on accessibility. And this general comment created by the CRPD committee talks about the difference between accessibility and reasonable accommodation. It says accessibility is related to groups, whereas reasonable accommodation is related to individuals. This means that the duty to provide accessibility is an ex ante duty. This is a very difficult word. It means state parties like China or Japan have the duty to provide accessibility before receiving an individual request to enter or use a place or a service. The duty to provide reasonable accommodation is an ex nunc duty, which means that it is enforceable from the moment an individual with an impairment needs it in a given situation. For example, workplace or school, in order to enjoy her or his right on an equal basis in a particular context. I'm going to explain about it a bit later, but let's look at some examples how the accessibility has been demanded by persons with disabilities in Japan. On the left-hand side, I hope the black and white photo is from 1970s, almost 50 years ago, when the public buses were not accessible. Leaders in the disability rights movement, they stopped the public buses, demanding accessibility. So there is a lot of citizens' attention. This is a black and white photo. And on the other side, on the right-hand side, I hope you're seeing this color film, color picture. They are also demanding accessibility today. I visited Tokyo today, and there were many tourists, including from China and Hong Kong. And now stations have elevators to reach the platform. Many people use it. I use it. Parents, mothers and fathers with small children, they use elevators. Old people use it. We now take them for granted, the elevators at the railway stations. But in Japan, only a few people know the elevators were installed because of these activities by the disability rights movement. People may think, oh, railway companies, they are very kind. That's why there are elevators at the railway stations. No, that's not correct. Only because of these activities by citizens and persons with disabilities, because of the pressure, companies had to react, and the government introduced subsidies to promote accessibility. But in Japan, majority of people don't know that. That is a pity. And going back to the difference between accessibility and reasonable accommodation. One example, or there are a few examples I use, but maybe this one is easiest. When we organize, or when you organize a seminar, well, just like this one today, how do you provide sign language interpretation or captioning? If it is accessibility, if the sign language interpretation is provided as accessibility, you prepare the sign language interpreters from the beginning. You don't wait for request to provide sign language interpretation. If you wait, or if you announce, are there people who are joining this seminar and who needs sign language? Please let us know. If there's a request, we provide sign language interpretation. Then sign language interpretation was provided as a reasonable accommodation for this Madame Yang, for instance. If accessibility is for everyone, you don't care if there will be any deaf person coming or not. I don't care. From the beginning, I make arrangements for sign language interpretation. Then sign language interpretation was provided as accessibility. But you make an announcement, okay, we are organizing this public seminar. Is there anyone who needs sign language interpretation? Please let us know, say 1 week before the seminar. And then we provide sign language interpretation. Then this sign language interpretation was provided as a reasonable accommodation for this person who asked for sign language interpretation. Another example is during the Second World War, the president of United States was Franklin Roosevelt. He was a wheelchair user. But when he was making speeches, he was hiding that he was using wheelchair all the time. But in fact, he was using a wheelchair regularly at the White House. So, as a reasonable accommodation to the president, White House introduced ramps for the president who was using wheelchair. But when the President Roosevelt died, those ramps were removed because it was reasonable accommodation to the president. Unfortunately, it was not part of the accessibility. So reasonable accommodation always focuses on someone, particular person. While accessibility is for the whole community, whole society. It's not for that person. That is the basic distinction between accessibility and reasonable accommodation. So sometimes it's more difficult for people to ask for reasonable accommodation because you have to ask for reasonable accommodation. So sometimes it's more difficult. But on the other hand, one person with disabilities is different from other persons with disabilities. So there's always a need or a room for individual request. So reasonable accommodation is more effective for individual request and individual needs. So now let's look at the accessibility, legal developments in the field of accessibility for buildings and transportation. I'm very happy to hear that there's a plan to introduce a new legislation on accessibility in China. That is very encouraging. In case of Japan, the first law for the accessibility was 1994, law for buildings accessible to and usable by the elderly and physically disabled persons. This 1994 accessibility law for the buildings mandated basic accessibility, including accessible toilets, very important, and parking space, and to public buildings, such as department store, theaters, and hotels. This was the first law for the accessibility, and it covered buildings. People in the bureaucrats who worked for Ministry of Construction and Building, they were aware about the problem of accessibility for buildings. So when there was a new government, those clever bureaucrats, they came up this idea of creating a new act for accessible buildings. It was quite limited, yes. That's why about 10 years later, in 2003, it was revised to include schools, offices, and apartments. Schools accessibility is, of course, very important for education, students and teachers. But also, when there's a big disaster, like earthquakes or tsunami, school accessibility is more important because in many places, schools are used as shelters, the immediate shelters, when the houses are thrown away by tsunami, when houses are destroyed by earthquakes. In many places in Japan, and maybe in China as well, schools serve as shelters. People in the community, they escape and they spend sometimes days and weeks before the new housings, before the temporary housings are built. So the accessibility for schools are important for education, but also for at the time of disasters. And then this accessibility promotion was followed by another law for the accessibility of public transportation in year 2000. A new law for promoting easily accessible public transportation infrastructure for the aged and for the disabled was enacted. This is called Transportation Barrier-Free Law for short. So first it was buildings, public buildings, and then transportation. And of course, the for instance, railway companies, for instance, they don't really like to spend money on accessibility. No, they don't. So there was a lot of pressure from the disability rights movement, who worked with politicians, and also some people in the Ministry of Transportation. They're always good bureaucrats who want to provide better services regarding transportation for everyone, including persons with disabilities, and also families with small children. Bureaucrats, they're also fathers and mothers. So this was the buildings first, followed by public transportation. And these two laws, buildings accessibility law and transportation accessibility law, they were combined in 2006. And it's called the Barrier-Free Act. And its official name is the Act on Promotion of Smooth Transportation, etc., of persons with disabilities, but it's called the Barrier-Free Act. This law combines both building accessibility and transportation accessibility, which makes sense because it has to be combined to make things accessible. If only this part is accessible and if this part is not accessible, it doesn't work. It has to be comprehensive. And yeah, in fact, I remember like 30 years ago. Yes, 30 years ago, as in that photo, when my friends and colleagues went to Shinjuku Station, which is one of the busiest stations in Tokyo. So many people take the train at that station. And every year, one day, remember it was sometime in November, in autumn. On that day, many wheelchair people, they go to this one big railway station in Tokyo, and they take the train. So the staff people at the station, they had a very tough day on that day because they had to carry the people in wheelchairs. They had to carry people in wheelchairs. But it's unbelievable, but the biggest station in Tokyo didn't have accessibility. There were no elevators. It's just 30 years ago. But now, there's been a lot of improvement. So one disability rights leader says Japan is a different country in terms of transportation and transportation accessibility, as more than 90% of major railway and bus stations have been made accessible during the past 2 decades. And now let me turn to one positive impact of Tokyo Paralympics 2021. The hosting Paralympics Tokyo made a lot of improvement of accessibility of hotel rooms. The accessibility of hotel rooms was so bad. It was very bad. When we hosted the East Asia Disability Studies Forum in Osaka in 2016, I was organizing and I looked for accessible hotels. Very few. And to our shame, even our university guest house, it was almost not accessible. So I had a very difficult time. And the law was very bad, very weak regarding accessibility of hotel rooms. Like typically only one room out of 100 rooms was mandated to be accessible. So like if I organize some meeting in Kyoto, and Pendin remember this very well, we had to look for one accessible room in this hotel, and because there's only one accessible room in this hotel, so another hotel and another hotel. It was very bad. And finally, it's getting a little bit better because of the one reason is Tokyo Paralympics. Because hosting Paralympics in Tokyo, the Tokyo metropolitan government and parliament introduced accessibility local regulation and mandating all new hotel rooms for hotels bigger than 1,000 square meters to be built as accessible. And because Tokyo, the capital, introduced this, the second biggest city, Osaka, always tries to compete with Tokyo. So, and Tokyo has done that. So Osaka was watching it. And when Osaka is going to host the Expo 2025, they introduced a similar regulation. If you are going to build, make a hotel, all rooms has to be accessible. Same thing. And Kyoto, with so many international tourists, they have also introduced the same local regulation. And for Kyoto, this applies to hotels of all sizes. Actually, we were going to host East Asia Disability Studies Forum in Kyoto in 2020. It had to be postponed because of COVID, 2021, 2022. Well, we couldn't do that. We had to online. But when I was, my colleagues and I was looking for accessible hotel rooms in Kyoto this time, no problem. I was so impressed because the new hotels in Kyoto, their rooms are accessible. So when I looked back, like 2016, when I looked for accessible rooms in Osaka, the big city, it was so difficult. But like 2 years ago, when I looked for accessible rooms in Kyoto, oh, no problem. And soon, I hope this will become the national law, making sure the new hotel, all new hotel rooms are accessible. And this is, I think, is one good impact, positive impact from hosting of Paralympics by Tokyo. Another major area of accessibility is information. In 2020, finally, the new act on facilitation of the use of telephones for persons with hearing impairments was introduced. Very late. It's very late. But because of this law and the what we call telephone relays service, now I can make a phone call. Sorry, this is a very old way. I have to push. I can make a phone call to a deaf person now. I make a phone call and I speak to a sign language interpreter who will sign to the telephone operator who serves as sign language interpreter, who will sign to the person I'm making a phone call. It was very late. It came only 3 years ago. But finally, deaf people can sign and the relay operator, sign language interpreter will talk to me. And then I will respond, I speak, and then the relay operator, the sign language interpreter will sign to the person, to the deaf person who is making a phone call. And only last year, Act on the Promotion of Measures Concerning Acquisition and Use of Information and Communication by Persons with Disabilities was introduced. So you can really see the big gap between the infrastructure, building and transportation came much earlier, and the information accessibility came very late. And for those who are going to make new accessibility legislation, I hope you don't make that mistake, because information accessibility is as important as buildings and transportation accessibility. And let's look at how the reasonable accommodation has been mandated in the legal framework in Japan as part of the prohibition of disability discrimination. It was only because of the CRPD, Japan's parliament passed the 2014 Act on the elimination of discrimination against persons with disabilities. This was part of the national harmonization measures for the CRPD compliance. Without the CRPD, most likely even today, there's no law, no act to prohibit disability discrimination. Without CRPD, most likely even today, there's no law to make it an obligation to provide reasonable accommodation. 2014 Act, it prohibited direct discrimination and also mandated provision of reasonable accommodation only in the public sector, So only, let's say, if you work for the government, city government, then you have the duty to provide reasonable accommodation. But if you're in a private sector, like my university, private university, no obligation to provide reasonable accommodation. But finally, 2 years ago, this act was revised and expanded the obligation to provide reasonable accommodation to the private sector. This revision was made in 2021, and this becomes effective on 1st of April next year. So from next April, like Ritsumeikan University, my university has a duty to provide reasonable accommodation. But let's say for now, it's not an obligation yet. But many private sectors, including private universities and schools, are now making preparations to provide reasonable accommodation in their services. Now the final part. Japan had the, last year, Japan had the first CRPD review, and we received the concluding observations from the CRPD committee. And just like any country, the concluding observations starts with the positive aspects. And I will introduce to you the positive aspects regarding accessibility. That includes the ratification of the Marrakesh Treaty to facilitate access to published works for persons who are blind, visually impaired, or otherwise print disabled in 2018. And the act I just shared with you, Act on the Promotion of Measures Concerning Acquisition and Use of Information and Communication by Persons with Disabilities. Act on Facilitation on the Use of Telephones for Persons with Hearing Impairment. Act on Promotion of Smooth Movement of Older Persons and Disabled Persons. The so-called Barrier-Free Act, which combined both accessibility law for transportation and building, and act to further the improvement of reading environments for visually impaired persons. Act on promotion of comprehensive and integrated measures for the realization of a universal society. These were listed as positive aspects regarding accessibility. And positive aspects regarding discrimination and reasonable accommodation was, of course, the establishment of the Act for eliminating discrimination against persons with disabilities and its amendment, obligating public and private business organizations to provide reasonable accommodation for persons with disabilities. But of course, there are so many problems and so many rooms for improvement. So the committee recommended to Japan implement an action plan and accessibility strategy in close consultation with organizations of persons with disabilities to harmonize accessibility across all levels of government, to embed universal design standards, and to ensure the accessibility of inter alia, among others, buildings, transportation, information and communication, and other service facilities and services open to or provided to the public, including those outside major cities. B, enhance ongoing capacity building programs on universal design and accessibility standards for architects, designers, engineers, and programmers. Before I finish, one new interesting program. Now, if you take a train in Japan, like Tokyo or Kyoto, each passenger has to pay 10 Japanese yen. I think it's about half yuan. And the money goes to making stations and trains accessible. We see this announcement at the stations to provide accessibility or to make the stations and trains. Each passenger is paying, each time you take a train, you're paying 10 Japanese yen or half yuan. And this was the idea of the bureaucrat, officer of Ministry of Transportation. Because particularly for the past 3 years, because of the COVID, trains were not crowded. So the train companies have big financial problem. But in order to promote accessibility, here it's was an idea of someone in the ministry to collect more from the passengers to make the stations and transportation accessible. But the public is, people are not complaining, no. And you are seeing this, what we call station platform doors, because every year, maybe 5 blind people fall down from the platform and killed by the trains. So like this kind of what we call station doors, they help prevent that kind of very tragic accidents happening to blind people. So this is part of the accessibility planning paid by passengers. Concluding observations on Article 21, which is freedom of expression and opinion and access to information. The committee recommends that Japan develop legally binding information and communication standards to ensure the accessibility of information provided to the public, including websites, TV, allocate sufficient funding for the development, promotion, and use of accessible communication formats, such as Braille, deaf-blind interpreters, sign language, easy read, plain language, audio description, video transcription, captioning, and tactile, augmentative, and alternative means of communication. C, recognize in law Japanese Sign Language as an official language at the national level, promote access to and the use of sign languages in all areas of life, and ensure the training and availability of qualified sign language interpreters. So I conclude by saying, in order to promote the rights of persons with disabilities, we need to promote both accessibility and reasonable accommodation. And the reasonable accommodation comes under the prohibition of discrimination against persons with disabilities. So now I look forward to your feedback, questions, and comments. Thank you.
作为常濑修教授演讲的语坛人，那刚才聆听了常濑修教授精彩的演讲。常濑修教授介绍了日本在实施残疾人权利公约，特别是无障碍和合理便利方面的情况，其中也提到了很多值得我们学习和借鉴的经验。比如说日本的残障人士，他们去推动这种无障碍的公交，还有推动地铁的直梯的建设，以及日本他们有专门的法律去禁止基于残疾的歧视，那这些都是很值得我们去学习的地方。那中国呢，也是残疾人权利公约的缔约国，所以我在这里也想跟大家简要介绍一下中国在履行残疾人权利公约的过程中，特别是对于无障碍这个规定的履约的情况。那我会结合中国提交的履约报告，以及联合国对中国履约的审议的情况进行介绍。那中国第一次提交履约报告的时间是在2010年。在2010年的报告中，中国政府提到中国当时有一个残疾人保障法，其中规定了关于无障碍相关的内容。另外，中国也有一些关于无障碍设计的技术规范和标准，比如说在城市道路方面的、建筑物方面的，还有在铁路、车站，还有机场方面的无障碍的标准。另外，当时中国也初步去建设无障碍的城市，那报告中也尤其提到了北京市和上海市的无障碍建设的情况。另外呢，中国的一些新闻的节目，他们也配置了手语翻译，一些重要的政府网站上面也进行了信息无障碍的建设。那针对中国履约报告的内容，联合国残疾人权利委员会对中国的履约情况呢，也提出了一些他们关切的问题和建议。就比如说，因为报告主要涉及到中国城市地区的无障碍建设情况，那委员会就比较关注中国农村地区无障碍建设的情况，希望中国政府能更多的去介绍这方面的情况。另外，委员会也关注到，在中国的司法诉讼中，聋人是否会被提供手语翻译的问题。委员会还关注到中国的关于网站建设的这种信息无障碍的标准，目前并不是强制性的标准。那委员会也希望中国能制定在网站建设方面强制性的标准。在2012年的时候，委员会做出了相关的结论性意见，给中国政府履行公约提出了一些建议，比如说，希望中国政府能够进一步提供农村无障碍建设的情况的资料，以及如果没有去履行这种无障碍建设的要求，是否会有相关的惩罚措施，以及问到了就是中国在如何去监测还有评估中国的无障碍的情况，希望中国能够进一步有这方面的资料。那委员会呢，也建议中国在建设无障碍基础设施的时候，不要仅仅局限于残障人经常出入的场所，而是要在更多的 环境中去建设这种无障碍的基础设施。那这个是2010年中国的报告以及2012年委员会审议的情况。那在2018年的时候，中国政府是向联合国提交了第2次和第3次合并的一个履约报告，那介绍了从2010年到2018年这8年期间中国的履约的一些进展。那在这个报告中，中国指出在2012年的时候，中国通过了无障碍环境建设条例。那这个条例的内容对于无障碍的设施建设无障碍的信息交流，还有社区服务都进行了相关的规定。另外，中国是继续开展这种无障碍的城镇创建的活动，截至到2017年底，系统开展无障碍建设的市、县、区共有1600多个。中国也在这8年期间新制定和修订了一系列相关的标准和规范，比如说关于地铁的设计，关于码头的设计。那中国也出台了《残疾人航空运输管理办法》，对于机场的无障碍设施和服务做出了相关的规定。那中国也在这期间去农村进行了这个无障碍环境建设的调研，会在未来继续去完善农村无障碍建设的情况。对于网站和信息无障碍这一块，截至到2018年1月的时候，中国有大概3万多个政务的和公共服务的网站实现了无障碍。另外，中国对于参加普通高考的残障考生是提供合理便利比如说，如果有视力障碍的考生参加考试的话，可以根据他们的具体需要去提供盲文试卷或者大字号试卷，延长考试时间等等。那这个是2018年的报告中介绍的情况。那从2018年到现在，中国的无障碍环境建设也取得了一些进展比如说中国正在制定无障碍环境建设法用一个专门的法律去对于无障碍环境建设加以规定。那目前这个法律的草案正在进行2审的过程中。另外呢，中国在去年通过了建筑与市政工程无障碍通用规范。那对比之前一些规范，他们没有强制性的要求。这一次这个建筑与市政工程无障碍规范，它所有的条文都是强制性的要求。另外，中国的检察机关也在积极的推动无障碍环境建设的公益诉讼。中国在去年也举办了北京的冬残奥会，那对于残障的运动员提供了无障碍的设施和服务。那这些都是一些近期的进展。那对于中国在2018年提交的这个履约报告，委员会呢也做出了相关的审议和提出了相关的建议。比如说，委员会有提到，在中国的法院里，虽然有为聋人提供手语翻译，但是有一些聋人朋友们，他们表示他们看不懂法院提供的手语翻译。另外呢，委员会也提到了，虽然中国在国家组织的考试中提供了合理便利，但是中国还没有在所有的教育环境中为残障的学生提供这种合理便利，也缺乏相关的法律上的强制规定。那在去年，也就是2022年的时候，委员会通过了对于中国履约的这个结论性意见。 在结论性意见中，委员会指出，在中国，残障人组织他们没有充分的参与去制定全面的无障碍战略。委员会建议中国在制定无障碍环境建设法的时候，应该去和残障人士以及残障组织去进行协商，征求他们的意见。委员会也建议中国在无障碍环境建设法中加入通用设计的原则，并将此作为基础。委员会还建议中国邀请残障组织去参与评估无障碍环境建设的情况。另外，跟日本的情况类似，在中国手语目前还没有得到法律上面的承认，所以委员会来希望中国手语能够在法律中承认它的法律地位，并且希望在生活的各个领域都能够促进手语的使用，确保为聋人提供合格的手语翻译。那这是中国在这2次审议的情况。那除了委员会提出的这些建议之外，民间社会也非常关注中国的2次审议。在第1次审议的过程中，中国就有民间社会组织提出了他们的一些建议和观察，比如说他们提出在中国对于无障碍环境的监管还不够明确。另外呢，对于不遵守无障碍环境建设的行为人缺乏必要的惩罚措施，以及在中国普通学校的无障碍改造做得还不够完善。另外，中国的民间社会也提出来，在中国有一些残障的无障碍的设施，在建设完之后，并没有进行持续的监督和维修，导致这些设施被占用或者没有办法使用。另外，他们也提到，残障人士在去医院看病的时候，缺乏相关的无障碍支持，比如说，很多医院并没有为聋人提供手语翻译，还有一些药品，它们的包装上面并没有考虑到视障人士的需求等等。那另外呢，民间社会也提出来，在中国无障碍环境建设条例中，并没有明确提到合理便利他们也希望中国的法律中能够明确提到合理便利。对于第2次中国的审议，民间社会也提出了一些他们看到的现象，就比如说，在中国很多法院、还有监狱、还有拘留所缺乏无障碍的设施，比如说没有坡道，或者说没有无障碍厕所等等。那以上就是在中国履约的这一个情况的大概的介绍。那我们也可以看到，从2010年到现在，中国确实在无障碍环境建设方面取得了一些进展无论是在立法层面，还有这种无障碍城市的创建层面，但中国也存在着一些问题和不足。那我们也希望在未来无障碍环境建设的过程中，能有更多残障人士的参与，包括让他们参与法律和政策的制定，以及包括让他们去参与去评估这种无障碍环境建设的效果，让他们去倾听他们本人的这种用户体验也是非常重要的。那以上就是我的关于这个中国无障碍环境建设的一些分享。那也希望能够在之后的问答环节听到更多常奈修教授的分享谢谢大家。
把合理便利这样一个义务从公共领域扩展到私人的领域之后，其实是会带来一个衡量上的难题。就如果这一个私人的单位企业，它没有足够的资源，或者说它以它自己的资源不够为理由来拒绝这么做的话，那么现实当中应该怎么处理才好呢？
Thank you very much for the wonderful question, a very important question. The reasonable accommodation in the CRPD and also the Japanese Act says as long as it doesn't create too much burden, as long as it's not, too expensive. So who decides that it is not too expensive? Japanese system is very weak. Japanese law is very weak. And there have been some court cases. Sometimes persons with disabilities win. Sometimes persons with disabilities lose. It's up to the court to decide if this request for some reasonable accommodation is too much. So if you are going to look for some good legislation in Asia, I would say the South Korean law that includes remedy is a good law to look for. Because there's always an argument whether this specific reasonable accommodation creates an undue burden. But more generally speaking, of course, in the first place, the public sector, it's more difficult for them to say, oh, this is too much. Government agencies find it more difficult to say this is too much. And even in the private sector, most of the services, private sector, they try, because now there's a framework, legal framework for the provision of reasonable accommodation. And it is true, some reasonable accommodation is very expensive. Let's say sign language interpretation or captioning. But most of the reasonable accommodation, majority of reasonable accommodation doesn't really cost much. It's just a small thing. Like if you're a blind person going to a bank, you ask the bank people to read the document. If you're a deaf person going to a bank, if you are lucky, you meet the bank people through signs. But then bank people can write. They don't need to speak. They can write down the important information to a deaf person, which is not expensive. And the important thing is to make people aware not providing reasonable accommodation is a discrimination. The public awareness raising. And also, the governments have local governments establish a section on disability discrimination. Next to my apartment, there is a public high school. And they were having a very strange sign. One sign, wheelchair. And above that, do not enter. Very strange. Above it said, do not enter. Below, the signs of the wheelchair. So I phoned the school. And they said, they are separate. This wheelchair signs means wheelchair accessibility. And do not enter signs means if you have nothing to do with the school, do not enter. Which was just crazy. But somehow the school, I talked to the vice principal, but they took some time. They didn't remove it. But now in our city, there's a section on disability discrimination. So I waited 1 week. And then I phoned the city office. My neighbor high school has this strange sign. Is this okay? So the city office immediately called the school. And then the following day, I walked, oh, it's gone. Good. So it's important for the government system to have a mechanism to deal with disability discrimination, including reasonable accommodation. Of course, there will be still many problems. There will be court cases. But if you have a section on disability discrimination within the ministry and within the local city government, they can help. I mean, unfortunately, I've been calling Yokohama City office a couple of times about discrimination, but they have been working. And I think it's important for us to make use of the law effectively. And then in the long run, more reasonable accommodation will be provided, and the general level of accessibility improves. Thank you.
好的，谢谢常奈教授。那接下来的问题其实是一个英文问题，就是关于那个聋人打电话的服务，有听众想问，那个是谁付费的？就是那个手语翻译的费用是官方付，还是说另外一个机构付？如果这个聋人出国了之后，他在国外，他还可以使用这个服务吗？就请稍微解释一下。
Yeah, therefore, there's a small premium for everyone, for all the users, just like the extra payment for the making stations accessible. But it's a small amount of money for each person. So I hear no one saying this is a bad idea. So because it's such a small amount, so when I make a phone call, maybe I'm paying for all the calls, not for this specific call. Like when I make a phone call to my deaf friend, I pay the money I pay is same as when I speak to my friend over the phone call, the same. But every user is paying very small money more for all the calls. So the telephone companies are not losing money.
好，如果大众都愿意去分担这个成本的话，这确实是一个很了不起的计划。那接下来还有人想问
Well, if the amount is not so big, if the amount is big, of course, people will complain.
对，那接下来关于日本的电视台呢？日本的电视台都有字幕吗？就是电视上的节目是不是也都有字幕？
No, it's getting better, and I don't have the figure of the head now, but it's getting better. But no, not all the programs. And the difficult one has been the news programs, because you know, they keep changing. They come a new something happens, they have to provide the captioning on the spot. So they have been slow to provide captioning to news programs. But on the other hand, news programs are most important, because if some disaster happens, that's the most important information. And actually, it's not as important as for those captioning for Korean dramas, for instance. But the TV stations are now providing captioning to news as well, but they always put an excuse, because this is provided instantly. There can be some mistakes, but as long as the main message, particularly in terms of disaster, which we have so much in Japan, the immediate information is most important. Not 100% accurate. No, that's no problem. But it's been slow, but it's getting better. And even today, not all TV programs have captioning, which is a big problem.
好的，谢谢您。那下一个问题是，就总体的无障碍水平而言，你会觉得日本也有城市和乡村的差别吗？城市和农村会不一样？
Yes, there's a huge difference. The law mandates the accessibility for bigger stations. So like in the city I live, in Yokohama, next to Tokyo, which is the one of the biggest cities in Japan, accessibility level is much better than my hometown, which is the northern edge of main Honshu Island. We are quite rural, farming and fishery, and people are moving to big cities. But the need for, and also it's a bit tricky, because most people in the countryside, they drive. So few people take trains or buses. Of course, there are some people, young people, high school students, and very old people, they take the bus, for instance. And because they're old, accessibility is very important. But this is beyond accessibility, but in the countryside, like in my hometown, there used to be more buses, but now people are moving to cities, so less number of people, so smaller number of bus services, maybe like, let's say, 3 buses in the morning to the city center, 3 buses in the evening coming back to the village. And provision of accessibility level is very bad. But but in the countryside, the biggest problem is how to maintain public transportation. It's to use public transportation itself is getting so difficult. So if I go back to my hometown or home village, I'll have a big problem because I don't drive. But the number of buses are so small. And how to combine, how to maintain the public transportation and how to make it accessible, it's a big problem.
好的，谢谢您分享的经验，我想我们可能也会有相似的挑战。那下一个问题是，日本您刚才说到有一些案子需要法院来解决， 那么在日本的话，律师就是给残障人提供法律服务的律师们，他们是怎么看待残障人的这个交流的无障碍的问题？比如说，他们会怎么看待手语，或者说他们自己会使用手语吗？就在法庭，律师这样一群人。
Right. There are some lawyers who can sign. Like the lawyers I know, they are brothers or sisters of their brothers and sisters are deaf people. So at home, they were signing. So small number, there's very small number of lawyers who can sign. But also for the private cases, I guess most likely they will be writing to each other because hiring interpreters can be expensive. And but there are some, yes, there are some deaf lawyers. Yes.
No.
There are some limited, very limited number, maybe 5 or all Japan. But there are some lawyers who are themselves are deaf. So, and I think they all live in big cities, yes. But they, if you're deaf and if you're a deaf client, most likely you ask for deaf lawyers in big cities. And in the countryside, most likely you ask for some volunteers who will sign for you. And sometimes some local governments provide, local governments also provide interpreters for important issues like court cases. And also for the court, and if you're, let's say, if you're involved, criminal cases, the court has to provide sign language interpreters, just like foreigners.
好的，很有用的信息，谢谢您。那下一个问题是关于这样一个政策倡导的过程，就是在日本的无障碍环境建设法律过程当中，是社群还是哪一些利益相关者，他们有一个自下而上的倡导，还是说是政府自己想要去改革这个法律，还是说政府受到了来自国际社会，比如说 CRPD 的压力，是如何造成这样一些重大的法律的变革的？背后的主要的原因或者是动力是什么？
Thank you very much for a very good question. In Japan, most of the time, the conservative parties are in power, just like today. But there have been a couple of times more left-wing parties or more liberal parties were in power. And when those limited times, when this conservative party lost the election and more leftist or more liberal parties are in power, this civil society and disability rights movement have been asking for accessibility. But then most of the time, conservative party was not so helpful. But when the leftists and the liberals are in power, the bureaucrats, they know how to change the system best. They suggest how to revise the law. It can be a very small thing. Like the first act on, the first act on buildings. Actually, this had nothing to do with the government. There was one clever bureaucrat. He knew about the problems of lack of accessibility for buildings. So he was working for the Ministry of Construction, and he included one clause. In order to get the low interest loan from the government bank, the building has to be accessible. That means if the building is accessible, the company who is building that building can get the lowest interest loan from the government bank. And of course, if you are in a construction business, you see, okay. In order to get the lowest interest loan from the government, I just make it accessible. So I get more money. But this was the idea of one bureaucrat in the government. He was very clever. And now it was around 1995, and I remember the construction company commercial messages suddenly started to talk about barrier-free, accessibility. And I wondered why. Very clever. And when there's a new government, these bureaucrats, they're always good bureaucrats. They have been thinking about accessibility. And they suggest to the new government how to make things more accessible. And these bureaucrats, well, some of them are mothers of children with disabilities, fathers of children with disabilities. They know the big problem. A lot of discrimination, they know firsthand. And they can suggest good revision to the law. And the politicians, wow, they're happy with these good suggestions, because they want to say, I made the things accessible. But the original idea normally comes from the civil society, because they are the ones who experience difficulty every day, going shopping, going to hospital, going to school, going to work, if they are lucky. So I always believe there's a need for the kind of a triangle: civil society, disability rights movement, bureaucrats, and the politicians. And when there have been made any major breakthrough in the disability policy in Japan, there has been always this triangle.
你好，是这样子的，我想问一下，这个我目前在日本啊，这个呢，我是一位听力障碍者。那么我想问一下，你刚才说到的这个问题的本质，你可能还没有提到，就是关于公民社会的一个重要的一个参与的力度。我觉得我们在大陆的这个特殊国情的情况之下，民间的力量可能其实还是比较有限的。那么老师在这一点上有没有什么自己的看法呢？好，我的问题提问完了，谢谢老师。
Thank you very much for the very important question. In any society, even in a democracy, the civil society by itself cannot solve problems. And as I said, you always need to find an ally, friends in different sectors. It can be the ministries or the executive branch, or it can be the parliament. These to create friends and allies in different sectors. That applies to democracy as well. But people with different disabilities, or deaf people, or hard of hearing people like you, your voice is most important. You can raise your voice in your situation. You make friends with other deaf people, but also with hearing people, some of them, I'm sure, will understand the challenges you face.
关于还是手语，就是在中国有的时候会发现，国家政府想要推广一种通用的手语，但是呢，在每个地方又有自己的自然手语，就是当地的手语，自己的聋人自己生活当中使用的手语，比如大陆的手语和香港的手语不一样。那么在日本也会有这种情况吗？有一个地方的手语，聋人自己的手语和国家想要去推广的一种通用的手语会不一样吗？
Yes, there used to be, before there were more dialects in sign language, as well as in the spoken sign language. They were very, very different in different parts of the country. But for the sign language, about 20 years ago, the national television started the sign language programs. And then it helped establish more standard Japanese sign language. You know, television, they are very powerful. So all over the country, people watch one sign language, basically. So it helped to kind of standardize sign language in Japan. But the more difficult thing is the difference between signed Japanese, which follows the grammar of spoken Japanese. That's spoken Japanese on one side. And the other side is the more natural Japanese sign language, which doesn't care about the order of the Japanese language. They are more natural sign language for deaf people. Like if your parents are deaf, and if you are deaf, most likely you'll be very fluent in the Japanese sign language. But this difference is still very big. And now the school for the deaf in Japan, you can sign. Like 30 years ago, it was banned. At the school for the deaf, signing was banned. It was very bad. But now signing is okay. But the sign language they use is not the Japanese sign language. It's the signed Japanese, following the order of the spoken Japanese. There's only one private school for the deaf established by deaf people and deaf lawyers that uses Japanese sign language, the real, can I say, real Japanese Sign Language as a language for the school instruction, but that is quite exceptional. So there's still a huge problem of the sign language in general, in education too.
所以有一个接着的问题就是说，您会觉得未来如果以聋人的这样一种无障碍交流的权利为例子，那么他们是如何去处理在国家的立法当中，是把哪一种语言当做国家的官方语言？如果有可能的话，是目前的这一种自然手语，还是说基于口头日语的那样一种手语？可能是哪一种会有得到更多的认同，成为立法当中认可的那种手语？
Thank you. We are still very long. We have still a long way to go before any sign language is officially recognized as a language of Japan. Because in the first place, there is no law that says Japanese language is the language of Japan. We don't have that. There's no law that says which language is the language of Japan in the first place. So you can imagine, if there is already such a law, the challenge is add sign language. But there's no law, no framework for that. So it's much more difficult. But if then the next challenge, as you said, is what kind of sign languages should be recognized. We are not clear about it at all because the Japan Federation of the Deaf does not have a clear position on that. These are the challenges we have.
所以我们可以说，这是一个仍然在发展中的议题，需要很多人投入去讨论的议题。好的，这个问题是关于，又回到了我们说那一个私人部门，就如果一个餐厅，一个这样的私人的企业主，他以自己的经营自主权为理由，拒绝为残疾人提供服务，那么这样一种歧视在法律上应该怎么认定呢？就他说我是一个老板，我可以决定我不想为了一些我不喜欢的人服务，那这个时候餐厅或者是卖面包的或者是卖蛋糕的，他拒绝为那样一些人提供服务的时候，怎么去看待这样一种歧视？这如何去用 CRPD 的语言来解释这样一种歧视？
As far as the Japanese Act is concerned, it's very weak. But this one, like denying services because of disability, is one of the most typical discrimination. But still, the government doesn't have the power to close it. It will just, I think, announce the name of the service. And of course, the local or the government people will come and first talk to the person, talk to the business owner. But the best thing the government can do is not close the business, but announce the name of the service. This restaurant is violating this law by denying services. So it's a still very weak legal framework for prohibiting disability discrimination.
这是关于合理便利，是否合理，或者说这样的便利是否公正？您有怎样的判断的标准，或者说有怎样的视角吗？就请允许我举一个例子，例如说我是一个视力障碍者，那可能我从小就更多的使用听力，那可能 更多人会认为，或者是整个社会会认为我们的听力是比较好的，所以就为我们在考试当中使用屏幕阅读器，但可能我们的这阅读起来还依然会有一些困难，或者说为我们讲述电影，会有很多画面通过口头的方式告诉我们，但对于我们来说，这可能需要我们有很好的想象能力。我觉得这是否也对我们提出了过高的要求，或者说这样的需要我们之前做一些准备是否公正这样的门槛。然后还有一些合理便利和无障碍方式，它可能是有一些歧视，或者说是有一些低标准的，或者说在其他人看来是对他们造成了一些不公平的、降低难度的，这样子的问题，您有怎样的看法呢？
Thank you for that very important question. Like the cinemas, there can be audio description as part of the accessibility. Because if you want some specific cinema house to provide audio description, I mean, explaining what's happening on the screen, that'll be very difficult. Because you would need one person, at least one person, to do that for you. Reasonable accommodation, the fundamental idea is not to change, not to cause too much burden, but also not to change the fundamental nature of the business. If it's a cinema, it's a cinema. If it's a music concert, it's a music concert. If you're a deaf person, and if you want to enjoy the music, there is something impossible. Because music concert is something you enjoy music. And if it's a film directors create visual information. And of course, there are ways to provide reasonable accommodation to blind audience, conveying the story by words. But asking for you, for instance, is very difficult. That's why I say accessibility and reasonable accommodation, we need both. Because the general standard of accessibility gets better, there will be captioning, but also audio description. Some guide who is explaining he or she is doing what and that. And if the general level of information accessibility gets better and better, there's less and less room for reasonable accommodation. So we have to promote both improving general accessibility, but also responding individual requests by reasonable accommodation. Even then, there will be still problems, challenges, but I really hope with better accessibility and more provision of reasonable accommodation, each disabled person faces less challenges.
非常非常感谢常来教授，感谢。